Egunon, buenos días, bienvenidas.
Good morning. Welcome. It is a pleasure for us to be here to speak about cinema, to speak about history. My name is Carmina Bustan. I am the Commissioner for the celebration of 50 years of Spain in freedom. And today I have here with me two university professors that are experts in relationships between cinema and history. And in Nicolas' case, he's an expert in contemporary history, but the audiovisual sector is essential, and the cultural references are essential in his work. Nicolas Sesma comes from the University of Grenoble. We also have Valeria Camporesi from the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid, and currently director of the Spanish Film Library, and we also have Professor of Contemporary History at the University of the Basque Country. So thank you very much indeed for being here. And I would like to briefly mention a projection we had here in Victoria Eugenia Theatre within this cycle organized in the San Sebastian Film Festival, and we had the opportunity to watch a film that reflects what we're going to be talking here. The film representations of Franco Dictatorship. The film is Canciones para Después de una Guerra, that could be defined as a portrait of the internal history of the dictatorship. It's a little bit of a collage of images, creative images of cultural folks culture and songs covering 4 decades of Franco's dictatorship, and provides an image that was not favorable for Franco's regime, and that's why it was forbidden and banned, completely censored in 1971, when it was going to be screened in the theatre, in the Victoria Eugenia Theatre, in the framework of this festival. And that's why we were really motivated to watch this film yesterday. It was screened in 1976, once Franco had already passed. And I wanted to mention that film because it was made during the dictatorship. It was screened in the Spanish transition and reflects this other dictatorship that was very different to the one that the regime, Franco's regime, wanted to provide. And without further ado, I would hand the floor over to Nicolas for him to tell us what is the image he wanted to convey through this film and through cinema in general. Thank you very much indeed, Carmen. Thank you. I would like to thank the San Sebastian Film Festival for having me. It's a pleasure for me to be here. Franco's dictatorship, and you mentioned Canciones para Después de una Guerra, but we're going to talk about films before a war, and we need to be aware of the importance of cinema when it comes to building the image that everyone can have about something, even about what's possible or impossible. I'm telling you this because Spain was one of few countries where the Potemkin film was screened. And it was screened in 1930, and then there was a whole set of countries that showed it. And when the coup came in 1936 in Spain, the Marines rebelled against that coup, and the officials were thrown overboard. It's hard to think that this could have been possible if the Potemkin film wouldn't have permeated. So we were fully aware of the importance of cinema when it comes to projecting some images and a framework of what possible and or impossible. And in this case, it was dramatic because officials, as I said, was thrown overboard. The Ministry for the Marine resigned when the Communist Party was legalized in Spain, because it was a especially affected military corps. So it was very important here, the image we conveyed through cinema. This was important in the dictatorship. The regime wanted to build a specific image of what was possible and what was impossible. And the regime was always aware of the fact that cinema worked in two ways, for internal consumption and in order to project a specific image externally. And so they were really careful with the films that were authorized, that could be internally consumed, that had this element of critique, like Bienvenido Mr. Marshall, for instance. And they also used it to project their own specific image externally. Bienvenido Mr. Marshall is a film that wasn't subtitled into English until very recently, like 20 years back. So internally, this was shown as saying, okay, look at our dignity. In spite of our agreement with the U.S., we're capable of criticizing a great ally. But they were fully aware of the fact that internationally this film was not disseminated at all. And then finally, I would say that maybe the best example would be Raza, a film that shows to what extent Franco liked cinema. If you visited, if you visited the El Pardo Palace, you will see that Franco used to have a private cinema there, and people would say back then that he would watch Raza once a week and that he cried every time he watched it. So there are two versions of Raza. The first one that was edited with so if you can stand to watch both versions, please do. The first version includes a high degree of critique to the U.S., and that's very normal because Franco had this anti-American environment as he was young, because he had lost Cuba, etc. And there's also this very critical viewpoint of the U.S. about everything that was libertarian in Spain. And then when it came to agree with the U.S. and negotiate with them back in 1953, a revised version of Raza was created where that anti-American critical element was pretty much reduced. And we see that the regime is capable of adapting its discourse, thinking about the public they're targeting, and that is something that's actually something we can see in the whole dictatorship guiding thread. So Raza encapsulates that ideal image of the regime's morale somehow. And there's a leap here, very interesting one, between Raza and Familias Franquista, El Desencanto, which is another interesting film. I don't know. Can you tell us what happens there in these 30 years? How can we get to this film where we see somehow the dismemberment of our family? Well, logically, the regime cannot keep up with that discourse. They need to be able to adapt. And this is something you see also in Franco's, in the films that were developed under Franco's regime. There was the renaissance of the civil society somehow. They were looking for the limits, to what extent they were able to make cinema within the framework of Franco's dictatorship, but the deepest message that was conveyed was basically the same. Actually, it's really interesting, and Valeria, I think that you can help us. What happened in the film industry back in the 70s? Well, thank you. Good morning. I'm really honored to be here. Thank you, Carmina. I would like to also thank the festival. Yes. As you were saying, when it comes to cinema, we need to bear in mind that, and I don't know how many of you attended the projection of Canciones para la Expresión de una Guerra, and when we saw Columbus's arrival and the indigenous people there, you see that's outrageous. What kind of audience can accept that? So when you think of the audience and the target audience there, you need to think about many, many things. And there are many nuances you can make here. Of course, the context is what it is in Spain under Franco's dictatorship. And that when you think about cinema historians, we have this discussion going on about when the end of the dictatorship started. And we have this very strong approach indicating 1973. And 1973 is when El Espíritu de la Colmena was made. And that was awarded the Golden Shell in San Sebastian Film Festival. So, and you see there in El Espíritu de la Colmena people that were killed and put to death. If you look at recent collections and reflections about that time, you see that there's a book that's a very interesting one, but you don't see a chapter that's saying we're going to be talking about the transition or Franco's death. A fundamental moment in time to understand what happens in cinema is set in the modernization. Back in the 60s, a whole set of cultural changes started to happen in Spain. That's something that feeds the audience and that will have an impact on the films that are produced in a context where obviously the legal situation is a situation of censorship, limitation, and therefore the cinema becomes a channel to transmit very specific values, very strong values. But if you look at if you think of the second reflection, whereby all these changes that are going on culturally and socially in Spain back then and how they generate inevitably shape the type of films that are produced, you see that in those years we have this third way of doing cinema. And there you see films that have this, well, commercial cinema approach that is there, where the target audience is the majority of the population, but that tackles themes like abortion, marriages in crisis, and actually all of this has to do with a society that is somehow exploding, and all the limitations that are imposed by Franco's dictatorship are showing that this explosion is going on. And I mentioned the spirit of the hive, El Espíritu de la Colmena. There was a high degree of censorship on Canciones para Después de la Guerra. 2 years after it was screened, 2 years, not 20 years, 2 years, a film that describes Franco's dictatorship as a hive, as a society that is repressed and oppressed and in anguish. And it got the Gold Shell Award in this festival. It was supported by it was supported broadly by the civil society, and this opens up and many things, and shows that there were many things that were moving and changing, especially that cinema where that auteur cinema, that type of cinema where you have this personal approach of the author, right? In this case, the directors and often screenwriters were able to express very deeply everything that had been accumulated along Franco's dictatorship over 40 years and everything that had occurred in Spain up until that time. From 73 to 75, we have many contradictions, and the cinema undergoes a dramatic situation because we have this very aggressive regime there, and we have a society that is asking for change. And then we have La Prima Angélica by Carlos Saura, and Berlanga then has to go and film Tamaño Natural in France because in Spain it would have been impossible. And Borao, an emblematic film where the festival played a huge role. And Furtivos, that was also awarded a Golden Shell. Then all of this is capable of orchestrating the defense of the films against censorship by playing with the fact that censorship at that time can go against the censors themselves, because it can create a very strong reaction by the audience. Borau plays with this very explicitly, and somehow he wins this game. So I think that without losing sight of what's been Franco's dictatorship and all the values that were created there, so we still think of cinema and filmmaking as a space where you can go and see maybe not so much contradictions, but rather a society, data about a society, information about the society, about society at that time that is changing dramatically at that time. Oh, thank you. You were saying that suddenly all of these films are screened and they start having a repercussion. I was remembering that when we presented Canciones para Después de la Guerra in Ore with Pablo La Parra, the director of Catalan Film Library, he explained the possible reason for this, why this film is persecuted so clearly, and maybe some other films don't undergo this process. And he said that there's this issue of a social class. Canciones para Después de la Guerra, it was a film that would reach out to the lowest classes, whereas Furtivos, La Caza, El Espíritu de la Colmena, they only reached out to a minority audience. And then a professor that Nicolas and myself shared, people at university, young people back then that went to the cinema and went out, said, okay, I've understood nothing at all. I don't have a hint about what this film is about. So you really needed to be very politicized at that time to understand these films. And that's why the censorship let these films be screened. And what happened in the Basque Country back then? What can you tell us about it? Well, Santiago de Pablo, I think that here the situation is slightly different to the one we have in Spain in general. Why? Because to begin with, we didn't have our own film production. This is not because of the dictatorship, of course, but rather there's a continuity there with previous stages. Franco's dictatorship didn't have to suppress Basque production because back in the Republic it was non-existent. So there was practically nothing that was being made concerning our own or Basque film production under Franco's regime. This doesn't mean that the film environment, Basque film environment of the time was not there. It was a very, changing situation. Normale Fakis, a professor, compared it to other dictatorships and said that there's no dictatorship in the world that evolved so much as Franco's dictatorship. And I think this is something you really see in cinema and other forms of expression. In the Basque Country, of course, there's no Basque film production. This famous Basque cinema was non-existent back then. It started in the transition after Franco died, but there were important things here. This festival is a good example of it. It was created in 1943 as an international film week, and then as an international film festival. And late in the dictatorship, there was this film festival gained high repercussion, both nationally and internationally. It is a good reflection of what was going on and of the contradictions of the regime. This is something you can see in Canciones para Después de la Guerra, and also reflects the existing repression. So, sometimes, this festival started in a very specific context, the context of a dictatorship, and we need to be fully aware of this. There are some Basque filmmakers that started making films in an amateur way, and in order to make their films, they ended up in Madrid, like, for instance, Víctor Erice, but there are others. Pedro Lea, Iván Zulueta, Javier Aguirre, José Luis Egea, And of course, in production, we have here the Elias Querejeta film cinema school that set a milestone in Basque cinema. So all of this context, ecosystem that was created around cinema made it possible that when other things could be said, then the Basque cinema was ready to tell us about all those issues. There's a film that is key, I think. Maybe some of you may know it, which is Amalur. Amalur is a documentary about the Basque Country. It was screened in 1968, both nationally and internationally. And 68 was an interesting year, and it's not by chance that Amalur, this documentary by Fernando Alarroquerta and Nestor Basterrechea, was screened back in 1968. It's a documentary about the Basque Country, as I was saying, but you need to put it in context. I mean, you understand things when they happen, as the first raza can be understood, and the espíritu de la raza can be understood, taking into consideration their own context. So this is not just a folklore-based documentary concerning the Basque Country. I mean, it is, and it isn't at the same time. In the 25th anniversary of the film, a specific publication was made, and people said, well, this is just a collection of images. I don't know if I'm allowed to mention who wrote that text, which is José Luis Rebordino, the current director of this film festival. I don't know if he's watching me. Oh, my God. But he said, okay, this is just a collection of images that, that is just thinking about nationalist people. And, well, he was right and he wasn't, because that film has that side to it, right? Because it's telling us about Basque tradition, Basque dances, Basque sports, but there are many things underlying that. I mean, and there's this need to develop a Basque language, Basque film language. This is a good attempt at that. And there's also this political claim behind it that is integrated in there, and that is very clearly seen. Of course, there is a censorship going on at that time, and so some frames were deleted, like Guernica's tree, and sometimes the term Spain is used in this documentary. So, but when my students watch this documentary, they're surprised that censorship allowed it, because there are many visual references pointing to our specificity, and because we don't just have ethnographic references, we also have very strong social references about a working class struggle, etc., etc. Indirectly, you see that in the film. So you see, of course, this is a film that has its issues, but it's also a milestone. It's really representative of what could be said at a Basque level in 1968, right? Let me just add a footnote here, very quickly. And later on, how is the Basque Country reflected on the screen? The Basque Country under Franco's regime, sorry. In 1976 or 77, we could show things and talk about things that would have been impossible before that. So the representation of Franco's regime in Basque cinema after the dictator died, was a topic that was tackled very often in those early years after the dictator died. But I think it's a partial approach. We have this vision of Franco's regime. Everything is like opposition to Franco's regime, and we would convey this image of Basques as not being supporters of Franco's regime, whereas when we know now that that's not the case. So we have this kind of modified vision of the Basque, and the Basque are shown as fighters through ETA, right? If you think about Comando Chiquilla or La Fuga de Segovia, that was released in '76, El Proceso de Burgos, especially, which is a very important film at that time. All of them are representing or telling us the fact that ETA represents the Basque people, and then members of ETA are shown as heroes, and these films forget about their innocent victims, which also existed under Franco's relationship. And this provokes something that is difficult to change. Even in the 80s, we have this modified vision of the Basque Country, that you see people fighting in the Basque Country, and the only ones that seem to be fighting are ETA's members. But we have these cultural struggles. We have democratic parties' struggles, because democratic parties were not that key, but they really fought against this dictatorship, and also the Basque church opposed the dictator's regime. And all of that we don't see in those films. And then finally we'll say that there's this film by Arantxa Lazcano, Los Años Oscuros, Urte ilunak in Basque. It was released in '93, and it's a pity because it wasn't a success, but I think it's an interesting film. I think it's interesting that there are like 5 to 6 historical articles or papers about it in the US, in France, stating that it is a good representation, a good reflection of Franco's dictatorship in the Basque Country. And I don't know if you have the chance to watch it, but I strongly recommend you to watch it. Of course, ETA is there, but you also have Basque National Party, PNV. You have the issue of language. This film is made in Zumaya, where people broadly speak Basque. So this film tries to overcome that stereotyped vision of the Basque, to show us the actual thing, the reality. This vision of childhood is also very typical in other films. So you have this very complex vision of what was going on back then at the Basque Country. And that's all for me. Well, thank you very much indeed. Congratulations, because you're sticking to your time. I'm going to do something that a chair shouldn't do, which is to participate. It's true that Los Años Oscuros is one of the few films that back in the 80s and 90s represent dictatorship fully. I mean, it tells you many things that you can learn. Back in the 80s, there's this other film that will fall into this category, and you might want to talk about Los Santos Inocentes.
Okay. I have a lot to say about Los Santos Inocentes. It makes me think that sometimes it's very unsatisfactory to see how the dictatorship is represented. It's very complex.
Oposición a la dictadura, sino que son.
It's not just that the dictatorship forced directors to go away. There are lawyers saying, where is the rest of the opposition? Where is the Communist Party? They're not demonstrating. So fragmentation of opposition strategically, practically, is so complex. It's so difficult to put it into screen. If for an audience who was not aware of the various groups in presence, they would be very lost. So it was extremely difficult, with the whole complexity of it, to put into images something that you can describe in hundreds of pages. So it was very difficult. We historians are very bad audiences for historical movies. Yes, I do agree. You are a specialist, and we look for the detail. And it's a mistake, because the audience at large needs to understand our history, but we are specialists, and we are looking for the details. Going back to what Carmina said, one of the films that reflects a specific history, a series of worlds that do exist, are Los Santos Inocentes. That's the movie. It's a masterpiece of literature, but it's a masterpiece in screen, the adaptation. with Alfredo Landa, and they need to sign, instead of signing with a signature, he doesn't want to put an X, and now he can write with his own name. And then there's the ambassador, there's the bishop. This is the bloody concile. They know how to write now, these poor people, and the little girl is going to go for communion. So it's a very short scene. In 3 minutes, we see a lot of things that are concentrated. The change in church, the pressure coming from outside. There is a change in mindset of the new generation. The boy, he doesn't want the tip. The daughter, she wants to do her first communion. So there's a generational change. And even though it's not a place in a no man's land, everything has been changing. Everything was very well shot with fantastic performances by the actors. We understand what the dictatorship was in the rural world and the lack of hope. Hope was lost. There was no promise of agricultural reform, and poverty was all over the place in the countryside. With the new generation, we see it, and in the movie it's adapted. It doesn't appear in the novel because the boy wants to go to the military service because he can escape his destination, his family, and his village. So it's an adaptation, and I think it was very, very good movies of the 80s. Without mentioning the fact that that was Franco, without mentioning the institutional infrastructure of dictatorship, it shows very well the oppressive world and what the population endured. If we had to choose a movie from the 80s and the 90s, El Sur is one of the great masterpieces of the time. And these two, Los Santos Inocentes and El Sur, are most famous. And during those years, even though many movies showed dictatorship and showed the war, but very few convey complex concepts. And sometimes it's just an anecdote, rationing of food, the orange tone that it's given by the director of photography. Finding these masterpieces that go deep into the time is important. In the 80s, in the 90s, the Spanish movies, Spanish cinema wanted to be modern, to be more European, and they didn't want to delve into the dictatorship times. I was proposing an exercise today. Let's think about specific movies. 21st century, the year 2000, it's an inflection point with a creation of NGOs, where NGOs and citizens want to recover their historical memory, opening cemeteries, opening the places where people were murdered during the war, opening graves and pits. And Salvador, tell us about movies in the early 2000, talking about the dictatorship time. Yes, I wanted to reconnect with what Santi said concerning the attitude that historians and specialists have when they watch a historical movie. And when seeing the past on screen, we only think about facts and figures and events. But after the year 2000, there's a new approach, an emotional approach to past events. It's a different approach. I need a couple of minutes to explain, because I wanted to make reference to a different approach. There were two classical approaches. How cinema tells history. There's a Catalan historian who summed up. It's very simple. We have the recognition cinema that uses what the audience has in their head, and it reinforces it. It shows with sound, with images, what is this recognition. It's more material. And then there's a cinema of knowledge. This cinema of knowledge tries to challenge what the spectators have in their heads, and it goes beyond what's in your head. So recognition and knowledge cinema. But then I would add a third style. As a spectator, I think about cinema of reflection on history. The 21st century, which has been so much criticized because of social media, AI, artificial things that dissociate us from the photographic basis of cinema. Well, this 21st century has given a lot, very important contributions to cinema and historical cinema. Almodovar, with Parallel Mothers, carries out this reasoning, this reflection on this topic. With this movie, Almodovar, what he does at the end of the day, and he said it, is to put in connection the personal dimension. We have a main character that performed by Penélope Cruz. She's got problems. She doesn't want to tell the truth. She doesn't want to tell the truth regarding her past event, dramatic event in her life. And then the connection with a social reality. Justice has never been done with the dead during the Civil War, with the murdered in the Civil War. And it connects with the last pictures at the end of the movie, where there's a mixture between dead people and human beings together. It's a very powerful image saying cinema is something that can reconcile us, and it can take us to facing up reality. And during Franco's dictatorship, there was conflict, there was opposition, but cinema can take us to another place. There is an emotional involvement in the past, and it makes it real. And La Trinchera Infinita is just another example of that. It leads us to another place. It calls out to young people, and young people really think about what is living under a dictatorship. What is that? This reflection is made today. We need to feel it and to understand what it is to live under a dictator regime. And Salvador, it's one of the films in the new century that is important to me, with Daniel Brühl. Despite all the hopes he's going to be executed, there's a close-up, frontal close-up shot, and he says, "What a fuck! That's fuck." It's true, a young person. He was fighting for freedom in an atmosphere where the norms of coexistence was disappearing, and suddenly they tell him that he's going to be murdered and assassinated. And young people should perceive it like it's a fucking event, that they need to realize what was living under a dictatorship. Sometimes we are persuaded of the importance of cinema and culture. It's good to reflect on the reasons why it is worth to continue talking about this. Why this type of movies bring reflection to our present-day life. It's relevant. I remember a criticism of Carlos Heredero about one of the great film, Secretos del Corazón, that was in the 70s in the Basque cinema. And he said he could recreate in his mind the real past with the smell of his childhood. The cream that his mother made for him, the dessert, and it's very nice because cinema brings you to your past or your childhood, and you can feel it, you can smell it. If you've lived in that decade, in that time, you can imagine what your life would have been. If you had to choose to pick a film that produced after the year 2000 that could help us talk about the reflection of dictatorship, Parallel Mothers is fantastic, because Almodovar, when he started his career, he said to the press, "I do cinema as if Franco had never existed." So he just forgets about that, but then the Spanish society evolves and was changing, and he adapted his cinema to that. What is your choice, Nico? Okay. It's a film, well, it's before the dictatorship times, by Alejandro Amenábar, Historia de la Guerra. Intrahistoria de la Guerra. Most of films about the dictatorship do not show us the high power spheres and the decision-making process during the dictatorship time. In Salvador, for example, it's surprising. Nobody shows us who is taking the decisions, killing him or not killing him. We don't understand who takes the decisions. So it's a fantastic movie. Daniel Brühl is very empathic, and he's fantastic as an actor. So I don't see the systematic cruelty of the decision-making process. Who decides about your life or your death? This Frankist part of the population and the decisions, we never see who takes decisions and who's in power. So Salvador, it's just one example. We see Franco, who is surrounded by Nicolás Franco, Serrano, Carrero Blanco, all his counselors, all these generals surrounding him, and they take the decisions. So we see the sphere of power. I just love the way in which Franco was shown, but not only the people around him, the advisors to Franco. We need to see another movie with a big Franco as the protagonist. We can see it in Dragon Rapid. I think it's Diego's film. This character, it's quite difficult to grab. It's not very cinematographic character. We need a good actor to do Franco on screen, because there's a great ambiguity, and he lacks energy, in fact. People show him as a shy person, but Franco wasn't shy. He had energy. He was an energetic man sometimes, but I would like to see this decision-making process, how Franco takes on power, taking advantage of the weaknesses, the vulnerabilities around him. He spoke about the cabanellas belonging to the Masonry movement, and that's the final scene, which explains how you can make historical research. It's a scene in the University of Salamanca. There's no recording, no radio. So to what extent we know that this happened or not? What would you look for? Where is truth? Are we talking about the consequences? Are you looking into the Unamuno's personal correspondence, looking for something in his house? So that film is very good to understand the foundations of dictatorship times. Santi? We're okay with time. We've been very disciplined. We're on time. Let's pick a series, because we have many films, many styles. Now we have films in all different screens, but many people watch series. Let's think about the Basque Country. I do agree with some of your picks, and I think they reflect many aspects of a dictatorship. It's so changing in a way. So we could mention lots of movies, and about Franco, it's very difficult because we have all these characters ingrained in our minds because we've seen so many documentaries, and for director it's very complicated, and for historian too. So they had to make an effort to choose. But talking about the Basque Country, in our local setting, La Línea Invisible by Mariano Barroso. That's a series that represents various elements that have already been mentioned. This movie has been following, there's been a historical coach, a historical advisor. They are this is very precise, very accurate. It's important. It's impossible to do a perfect, accurate movie because we turn into words a complex reality. It's impossible then to translate it in turn to movies because you use people, actors and actresses. But this is not a movie of historical knowledge. What happened in '68 in the Basque Country after the first murder committed by ETA, Leopoldo Pardines. Then the Guardia Civil killed Xavi Etxebarrieta, the first ETA member that was killed, and then Mr. Manzanas, which was a premeditated murder in Irún. It wasn't by chance. So the beginning of the terrorism movement in the Basque Country. The historical part is very well managed and shown, and invention is there. It's necessary to have some invention, some fiction during the movie, but some people didn't like it. Oh, yes, they need to invent something because we need to give emotion to characters. So you need to invent, to create things, to do some more fictitious, because characters cannot be white or black. They need to be gray, shades of gray. They need to evolve. And Benito Manzanas, this character, needs to evolve. Otherwise, he loses his cinematographic strength. They talk about repression, but it's also the story of the daily life of many people. Why a person, a young person, he was very young. He was one of the first members of ETA. It's a personal decision he took. He decided to kill a civil guard. And why Melitón Manzanas is torturing and ordering tortures in a brutal way to many people in San Sebastian. So these gray shades, this variety of characters, of atmospheres, is very well told in this movie, and it invites us to reflect, to think about it, because it's not a close-end movie. It is open, and we can have room for thought. That's why I chose this film. And Valeria mentioned the cinema for reflection. It's about cinema of recognition, cinema of knowledge, and cinema of reflection, too. Pan Negre, that's another title in Catalonia. Black Bread by Villaronga, Pan Negre. That's another example I want to put to you. Talking about serious, Televisión Española, Spanish television, has produced Cartas a Eva, 2 or 3 chapters. You can watch it on the website of Spanish television. And what they do is to show other events, something that was missing in the 80s and 90s, social struggles, the working class struggles during the dictatorship, the importance of women, their role. And in this film, Black Bread, it's very well portrayed. And then they look at the complexity of the times. Sometimes it's very pedagogical. It's Villaronga style in Black Bread, and that's an interesting approach. The bad guys are not that bad, and people live in gray shades. Do you want to speak about Pan Negre, Black Bread, or another movie? Yes, we have several minutes, or we can have a Q&A question with the people in the room. You spoke about complexity. La Buena Letra, I haven't had the opportunity to see it. The cinematographic adaptation of Sierbe's novel. Microphone, please. Okay, you can tell us more about that then, because you know about this. Pan Negre, Black Bread, or let's have time for questions and discussion with the audience. Okay, an advertisement now. It's the right moment. It's the place, right place for this. with the festival and the commissioning cycle, we created Young People, Memory and Democracy, how to talk about this dictatorship event to the youth, how to make young people reflect on concepts like freedom and democracy that are taken for granted today. And this afternoon, we have a movie called La Marsellesa de los Borrachos by Pablo Gil Retuerto, Tomorrow, Nuestras Derrotas. It's a French film, Our Defeats. It's about the '68 movement in France with college youth. And I think this could be an interesting experience. You can tell us, what about La Buena Letra? What do you think about La Buena Letra? You can tell us about your opinion. Microphone, please. I remembered about La Buena Letra when you said that we need to choose films that touch your emotions. But this movie doesn't put the emphasis on the economic or social context. We cannot see scenes of people pursuing or chasing other people. I don't know who shoots in the movie. It really connects with our emotions. People who are living at the time, and it's in fact two men, two women, how these people live and go through the relationship with the others who show a different way of living in the same situation in the same time. A person said things should be like this. The other character knows that things have to change, but there are doubts. You need to listen to others. People have different experiences during a dictatorship. So I think the treatment, the approach in this movie is very, very interesting. Yes, in the rural world, sometimes it's been forgotten. It's not very frequently that you can see the rural world depicted in films during the dictatorship of Franco. From very small stories, you can really represent what was moral and material misery of the dictatorship times. With very little details, with little gestures, little things, you can tell a lot. You don't need 100 pages. In just 2 scenes, you can summarize what people went through in that time. We are historians and we work with the tools of history, but we are all aware of the power of a graphic novel, and a photographic exhibition, a series, a movie, to really tell a lot and in a very efficient way to convey the message. Yes, in fact, your comment is really relevant because Pablo shows us something, because I am a historian. I work in cinema, but I am a historian. The history that we research, our studies, what we publish, in fact, comes out of our context and our questions. The question of women. What is missing in the description of that historical era? Sometimes we didn't realize that women were missing. The female presence, their perspective was missing. And these questions appear in movies. Where are women? The series called Querer, about gender violence, is fantastic. It's a fantastic series. We can see so many things. It goes beyond our philosophy. So thank you very much for your words, because it's exactly what was missing. Questions, comments, suggestions of the movies? Well, this video, this recording will be uploaded on the website of the festival's website. We will make a list of all the films that we mentioned. We will have a fantastic playlist with recommended movies. So please help us. If you can mention some other examples of movies to include in our playlist. Te estoy llamando locamente. That's another one. Yes, indeed. I see young people here. We're going to ask you to give your pick. Sometimes we give it for granted. The topic of homosexuality, that during Franco's time, people couldn't love who they wanted. So this is put into question now again in Spain. So I take note of your choices. More? When you spoke about the dictatorship, we need to see the international context. I come from Argentina. We've been through several dictatorships, and there is a great porosity depending on the political movement, depending on the interests of a regime. And there are international repercussions that are different. For me, I remember my childhood. Talking about 68 or 73, these are they are key years, important years, for many reasons. And this goes beyond the transcendence of Franco's dictatorship. I say it because we need to understand the back and forward movements and the different journeys, what comes out of a dictatorship according to the historical context and when the films were produced and what happened in every place in different locations, because we now have globalization that was invented in the 90s. But we went through that well before. We have different understandings of history because we went through these events before Europe. Yes, the international context is essential. Valeria was saying that until a female character in a movie, until you see women in the movies, you don't think that something is missing. There was political violence in films about Franco. We don't have an official history. We don't have an Olimpo garage like in Argentina. La Noche de los Lápices is another example where we really see clearly torture and violence from the dictatorship people to the opposition. Salvador is one of the first movies where you can see this violence. Crimen de Cuenca, which is a metaphor. El Lute, there's also a torture scene, but it's just a common prisoner, not a political prisoner. So this was missing too. And so we need to compare with the international cinema or Argentinian cinema, and then you can see what was missing in Spanish movies, and that's really interesting.
In Informe General by Pere Portabella, you can also see torture scenes. Quite subtle, it's true, but then they're there. According to other dictatorships, well, in here we also had this civil war, and people always tell us, okay, one more film about civil war. You know, you don't actually have films about the civil war where you see people killing each other from the trenches. You don't have many. You see, up until Ken Loach's film was released, Tierra y Libertad, I can't really remember any of this. It has nothing to do with U.S. cinema. I'm fed up with seeing Confederate fighters taking this hill in I don't know where. You know, you don't have anything of that kind in Spain concerning the civil war. And the Argentinian dictatorship stems from a coup. And you don't have that previous episode where any violence is identified with the war. Like in Spain, that makes a difference, I think. Concerning the civil war, I think that we have a problem with production. You know, it wouldn't be the same making a small film about something really specific about a small town, or creating war scenes. We're very used to Hollywood movies, and they're so spectacular. You need to be more spectacular than them. You know. And then as for the international ingredient, of course, this context is essential, especially concerning torture. The Basque cinema conveyed this really early, but it's really focused on that. If you think about Estado de Excepción, that's an early film, and it had problems with censorship. This was back in 1976. And I think that it is really partial. It's focused, again, on ETA members and doesn't focus on other things that happened in Spain previously. Yes, and I think there's this side of things of concerning transition process. I mean, dictatorship ended. Then there's this, is this a truth commission or not? Are there trials or not? And that contributes to the way we're going to be remembering that story, right? And before we move on, I think you've asked for the floor. Can you recommend us a film for our list? If you had to choose an Argentinian film to represent the history, dictatorship, democracy, and transitions. Maybe Cierra tus ojos. La mirada de tus ojos, yeah. El secreto de tus ojos. That's the one I'd pick. 1985, about the trials. Yes, it's a controversial film. It's a reconstruction, controversial reconstruction. But El secreto de tus ojos, I believe, has been a transition between, everything that's political, personal, and sociological. And that gives importance to contradictions and to human misery even. And that adds value. Although 1985 undoubtedly plays a key role for everything that it represents. Good, thank you. I wanted to ask you very briefly, very fast. What would you recommend concerning the vision of foreign filmmakers that displayed our dictatorship and how sensitive they've been? Some of them were fully aware of the fact that in our own country we still today don't speak much about that, especially among the younger generations. And I thought about Benicio del Toro in El Espinazo del Diablo, and how it represents reality, or even in El Laberinto del Fauno, even if it's a terror films. I think it's interesting to attract younger audiences. I think it's a unique opportunity to attract young people that through terror film get to know some episodes about our own history that wouldn't be exposed to otherwise. And I think this is a good example of how in foreign countries people have reflected about that. You mean contemporary or? Yeah, okay. Yeah. Hard to say. David Simon from The Wire, who had a relative who came here with international brigades, was preparing a documentary on international brigades. I would ask him to do it in Baltimore. And I think, we've heard about this recurrently, but I think they have some production issues. I believe it would be a wonderful gift, because Simon has the necessary depth there to do something that's really interesting, including many different approaches, etc. I think that foreign interest is mainly based on commercial interest. I mean, is this going to be interesting people or not? When Freeman made Y llegó el día de la venganza, this was released like a super production. They thought they were going to make a lot of money because there was Anthony Quinn there, and the film went completely unnoticed. Practically no one remembers it. And he believed that people were marked by the Civil War, but then he realized that the Civil War was dead. And then there was Julián Grimau's issue, and then, well, maybe the Civil War was not as dead as we thought. Anyways, apart from the classical films, ¿Por quién doblan las campanas? For whom the bells toll. There are documentaries as well, foreign documentaries, but many of them focused on international brigades. It's like a symbolic reference in Canada and in other countries. They focused on their own international brigades. But it's really hard to think about of something now. You know, it's really hard to make some fiction concerning Franco's dictatorship and the Spanish Civil War. You need contextual references for viewers, foreign viewers, for them to understand. We have this Nordic fiction. If you have filming, it shows to what extent the Spanish Civil War is an international reference, especially for people who went and fight in international brigades. And probably in Spain, we're not fully aware of this. First of all, because of the censorship of dubbings, and then, on the other hand, because it's like minority films. We're talking about Los Años Bárbaros. It's a 2-episode series that was very important in Denmark. And one of the main characters, the son of the person who cleans in some rich people's house, becomes a fighter in international brigades. The gold rush, it was like the story of how the gold in Oslo was saved. And there's this character whose name I cannot even pronounce, who came and fought international brigades. If you look at Los Cañones de Navarone, please watch it in international version, because there you have a character of someone who came and fought in Barcelona. He's called the Butcher of Barcelona, I think. And in the dubbed version of the film, this was eliminated. And the same thing happened in Casablanca when the film was dubbed, when Spain and the Civil War were mentioned. So I think there's a whole series of countries in Norway, Denmark, Holland, where you have these figures that have a link with Spain, and nevertheless, we still haven't had any super production about them. It's funny because there's this film La Comuna in Film Nordica that starts with the announcements of a death. It's a community of young couples that live together in a house, and the film begins with the announcement of Franco's death and everyone celebrating that. People living thousands of miles away feel this as being their own. And maybe Alain René and Jorge Semprún, they both made a couple of films that are interesting. La guerre est finie and The Two Memories, Las Dos Memorias. And then you have other examples. La Prima Angélica, I think. It's a good one. I wanted to mention a film that's here in this festival. I am a film historian, and I have this foreign approach from New York. And I'm talking about El Balcón Vacío. That deals with the exile, the topic of exile. And it's a spectacular film. And it's huge. It was an awful copy that I watched in the University of Columbia, and I had access to, and now it's been restored, and it's it's available. So I believe the Republican exile is a topic worth dealing with. It's an important example, and this film in particular I would recommend. And I'm really happy that it's been restored. It's worth watching. Another example would be the Spanish Earth. And its impact is huge, not just in the field of documentaries, but also in the narrative sector. Even Scorsese says that this is one of the films that really had an impact, a huge impact on him. That one goes straight to our list. Thank you very much indeed for mentioning it. I wanted to invite the under 30, the members of the audience that are under 30 to please participate as well. When you asked about Argentina and Spain, I thought about El Silencio de Otros, a wonderful documentary where you see not just what happened, but you also have this solicitor who's Argentinian, who's in exile in Spain, trying to get Franco's crimes to trial in Argentina, unsuccessfully. And then I remembered El Maestro que prometió el mar, which is wonderful as well. The main character works in La Buena Letra as well. Since Nicolas mentioned decision-making, and I think that's an important issue, I remember a film I recently watched, Llueve en Santiago, about the coup in Chile. There are many French actors there, but it's a film I would recommend. I think it's from 1975. I can't remember the name of the director anyway. Are there any further questions or suggestions for our list? I think that we kind of forgot about Fernando Fernán Gómez. No one mentioned it, a man who went to war, and some other films. And Elena Taberna made La Buena Nueva, where you see a civil confrontation between people living in small towns. Two more. Yeah, and about Fernando Fernán Gómez, Mambrú se fue a la guerra. I believe it describes very, very clearly that game between the context of a film and what you're telling in the film. I think it dates from 1985 or 86. And even though it happens in 1975 and explains how Franco died and how this grandfather was hidden in a hole, and he was one of those moles that could get out once the dictator passed. And suddenly you see how the family is a little bit dragged by that consumerism wave, and they told you, you're going to be paid some money because of your grandpa's situation. And then they thought, okay, well, I'm going to be able to buy a dishwasher or a washing machine, whatever. And then the grandfather has to go back to his hole. And I think it's an intelligent way of conveying all of that. So yes, thank you very much indeed. And La Buena Nueva is a very good one. La lengua de las mariposas. Yeah, yes, indeed. It's one of the first ones. They show about children and how all this is explained at school. And too serious, Las Abogadas. I don't know what you think about it, but I think it's a really hard one. And then there's this one, My Almudena Grandes. Paciente del Dr. García.
¿Queréis comentar?
Would you like to comment on Abogadas, and then we close this panel? Well, if we focus on the war, well, there are many. There's always this discussion going on about whether there are too many or too few. We don't really know. But it depends. It depends what you're comparing us with, or who you're comparing us with. But there are quite a few films about war, civil war. And I was thinking about a Korean film, a recent Korean film whose title I can't remember. December 25 is the date of a recent coup in Korea. And I watched this and I thought it was really interesting. At a specific moment, you know, a military needs to decide whether they join or not that coup. And I tell my students, you know, back then when the coup happened in Spain, you know, there was no smartphone. You couldn't call anyone. How could you make a decision where you had this part of the military rising, and some of us didn't quite know whether to adhere to the coup. But I think that Manolo would even made something about Emilio Mola, but it wasn't for TV, and it didn't work out very well. It wasn't very powerful. But for instance, I think this is a very powerful idea. Thinking about what you said concerning how everything started. And Arde Madrid, I was thinking about Arde Madrid. We didn't mention that. It's a series that is also reflecting Franco's real dictatorship from an emotional viewpoint in this case. Many things come out now, and it's really nice that you can suggest other things. So that we'll be sharing this list, and of course you'll be able to add more titles. And concerning Las Abogadas, I would say that any work that enables us to put on the table themes that haven't been dealt with, in this case, political violence from far-right movements and groups, you see that our transition was not a benchmark, as we tend to hear quite often. And you see that there were many movements, many things going on there in that democratization process. I missed in that film, and sometimes we focus too much on them as main characters, and sometimes I tend to forget thousands of people who went out in the street every day in the neighborhoods. Like in 1975, in the first 3 months of that year, there were thousands of strikes. At that time, strikes were banned. So that's interesting. You can see that slightly, but it was chosen to focus on them as individuals, and you have that sentimental side of things there. But I think that everything adding to the discussion is interesting. And that would have enabled us to talk about all of these things. That's a problem you have in 47. The film is wonderful, but no mention is made to the fact that he's a member of a trade union called Comisiones or PSUC. So you lose that collective movements that were going on. And I completely agree. You need fiction, you need a main character, but you can also convey some ideas of what was going on back then and the context at the time and concerning protests. And two more, Siete Días de Enero by Bardem and the FIA series by Radio Televisión Española. I haven't seen it because I have limited access to the platform, but it also focuses on Las Noches de Tefía as well. All right. We're going back to this idea, and I think it's good, a good idea to close. The power of the audiovisual, how powerful films are. I have this PhD on contemporary history, and I never heard about Tefía until the series was screened, and there was this about this concentration camp in the island of Fuerteventura, where most of the inmates were homosexual, and there was a place where they were re-educated. So it's putting this into images and showing it to the general audience. I think it's wonderful, and this is why we're here, I guess. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks to everyone. It's been a pleasure. We will share all of this. We'll share the list with all of you. It will be on the Film Festival website and also in hispanaenlibertad.com, I think. hispanaenlibertad.gov.es. Oh, if you Google Hispana en Libertad, I think you'll get it. Well, you should, at least. Thank you very much indeed.